Everyone believes that the US dollar is money, but it isn't. It's debt. That's the paradox the modern world is built on. The richest nation in history made its currency out of something it owed. If you think that sounds absurd, you're right. How can a country borrow what it already prints? How can the world's most powerful empire base its wealth not on what it owns, but on what it promises? To answer that, you have to look beneath the slogans of freedom and prosperity and see the machinery of credit ticking underneath. Because America didn't just invent a currency. It invented a system where debt itself became wealth. And everyone else, from London bankers to Asian exporters to you and me, was drawn into that equation. Let's rewind to 1913. Officially, the Federal Reserve Act was about stabilizing the economy after repeated banking panics. But beneath that reform was something deeper, the legalization of perpetual debt. The dollar was no longer a simple note redeemable for gold. It became a claim on credit issued by a private banking network, with the state as guarantor. From that moment, every dollar that came into existence had a twin, a liability on someone's books. It worked because trust replaced metal. In God we trust, the note says, but what it really means is in debt we trust. Every time the US government borrows, it issues Treasury bonds, and those bonds become the raw material for the banking system's money creation. Banks buy the bonds, lend against them, and multiply that same promise again and again. The result? A prism where promises, not production, fund empires. And it was genius because it made everyone a participant. Foreign nations didn't just accept dollars, they needed them to trade, to store reserves, to pay their own debts. The global economy became a single credit chain with Washington at its center. But here's the hidden rule, what we call the debt law. Once a society defines its wealth by debt, it can never afford to stop borrowing. Growth becomes oxygen. Without new credit, the system suffocates. So the United States turned borrowing into a patriotic act. The war bonds of the 1940s, the savings bonds of the 1950s, the Treasury auctions of the 1980s, all sold under one idea. Lending to the state is the safest investment on earth. Few realized that what they were really buying was time, an extension of a promise that can never be fully kept. Every empire before has built its power on gold, land, or labor. America built it on obligation. And like all systems that turn faith into currency, it demands constant belief. Because if the world ever stops lending, the empire stops breathing. To understand how America turned borrowing into law, you have to return to the moment when the country's future was measured not in gold, but in signatures. It's December 1913, just before Christmas. While most of Congress had gone home, a small circle of men passed a bill that would change the nature of money itself, the Federal Reserve Act. They said it was about stability. They said it would prevent crises like 1907. But what it really did was privatize the power to create credit and make the US government its first and biggest customer. Before that, money was simple, clumsy, but honest. The US Treasury printed dollars backed by gold and silver. If you had a note, you could walk into a bank and exchange it for metal. It wasn't perfect, but it had an anchor. After 1913, that anchor was replaced with a promise, a Federal Reserve note, redeemable not in gold, but in lawful money. What was lawful money? Whatever the system said it was. This was the Quiet Revolution, the birth of elastic money. For the first time, the quantity of currency could expand endlessly, not by mining or trade, but by borrowing. Every dollar became a loan from the future. Every expansion of credit meant a deeper chain of obligation. The architects of this new world weren't politicians, they were bankers. J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg, Nelson Aldrich, names that still echo in financial history. They understood something simple but powerful. Whoever controls credit controls governments. By centralizing the issuance of money, they made the state dependent on their system, and their system dependent on constant debt. It was elegant. The Treasury would issue bonds, the Federal Reserve would buy those bonds, either directly or through private banks, and credit the banking system with new reserves. Those reserves would then multiply through lending, creating deposits, which the public accepted as money. A perfect loop. The government owed the banks owed the public, and the public owed the government through taxes, inflation, and interest. The genius, or the trap, was that this mechanism was legal. Debt creation was written into the nation's laws. That's why we call it the debt law. When Congress authorized the Treasury to issue bonds, it didn't just borrow money. It created the instrument that would become money. Look closely at a dollar bill. It says, Federal Reserve Note. A note is not wealth. It's an IOU. It means someone, somewhere, owes someone else. You hold debt, not value. And yet that same debt runs the world. After World War I, this new machine became unstoppable. Financing a global conflict required sums far beyond gold's limits. Between 1914 and 1918, the U.S. national debt grew from $3 billion to over $25 billion, an 800% increase. But instead of collapse, the system thrived. The bonds were sold, the dollars flowed, and America emerged as the new creditor to the world. By the 1920s, Wall Street was the empire's mint. Money no longer came from mines or trade routes. It came from ledgers. The British had ruled with ships and colonies. The Americans would rule with credit. And that's how the foundation was laid. The Federal Reserve was not just a bank. It was a converter of promises. It turned national debt into global liquidity. And in doing so, it made every future crisis both possible and necessary. Because when money is born as debt, it must keep expanding or die. If this gave you a new way to see 1913, the year America outsourced its soul to credit, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. For half a century, the system worked so well that no one questioned it. The debt law became invisible, a background hum to the American dream. You worked, you earned, you borrowed, you grew. Everyone did. It felt natural. But the truth was that prosperity wasn't being earned, it was being financed. The illusion began in the 1940s in the smoke of World War II. When the war ended, the United States held 2/3 of the world's gold and half its industrial capacity. Every nation owed Washington in dollars, and every dollar was in turn a piece of U.S. debt. The more the world rebuilt with American loans, the stronger the illusion became, that debt was growth. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 sealed the deal. Delegates from 44 countries gathered in a quiet New Hampshire hotel to decide how the post-war world would measure value. The answer was simple, through the dollar. But that meant something radical. The world's reserve currency would be based not on gold itself, but on the promise that the U.S. government could always pay its bills. At $35 an ounce, foreign central banks could, in theory, exchange dollars for gold. In practice, they rarely did. Why trade the most flexible instrument on earth, U.S. credit, for a lump of metal? So the illusion deepened. Gold was the myth, the dollar was the magic. The 1950s and 60s became a showcase of what credit could build. Suburbs bloomed, highways stretched from coast to coast, corporations merged, expanded, borrowed, and boasted. For the first time in history, entire generations were raised not to save, but to spend. Buy now, pay later wasn't a slogan. It was the moral code of the new age. Governments did the same. Washington ran deficits for prosperity, convinced that as long as the economy grew faster than the debt, everything was fine. Economists like John Maynard Keynes gave this arithmetic a philosophy. Spending was salvation. The more the state borrowed, the more it could inject money into the system, fueling jobs, profits, and confidence. It worked until it didn't. Because underneath the glow of post-war growth, the numbers were compounding. By 1960, U.S. debt had reached $290 billion. By 1968, it was $368 billion. The Vietnam War alone cost over $100 billion, financed almost entirely by bonds. The guns of Saigon were paid for with the same paper that built the homes of suburbia. But the illusion was global. European and Asian economies held their reserves in dollars, trusting the United States as the ultimate debtor that could never default. That trust was the real currency, and like all faith-based systems, it demanded ever greater belief. When Charles de Gaulle of France began asking for gold instead of paper in the mid-1960s, the facade cracked. He saw what few dared to admit. The U.S. was printing claims on gold far faster than gold itself existed. Arithmetic was catching up with politics. Still, inside America, it didn't feel like danger. It felt like triumph. Wall Street boomed. Middle-class families bought color TVs and Chevrolets. Credit cards appeared. Borrowing felt empowering, modern, even patriotic. The government could always issue more bonds. The Fed could always buy them, and the rest of the world would always accept the dollars. It was the age when paper wealth conquered reality, when every new loan looked like progress, every new deficit looked like strength. But behind the curtain, the same equation held true. For every dollar created, a debt was born. The empire was feeding on its own promises, mistaking leverage for prosperity. And when a system forgets that its wealth is borrowed, it stops asking how much is owed, until the bill arrives. If you're starting to see how growth was built on an illusion of infinite credit, leave a comment and tell me if your country still believes in it today. It's August 15th, 1971. President Richard Nixon appears on television, calm, rehearsed, assuring Americans that your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. He was lying, not maliciously, but historically, because that night, the world's financial mathematics finally overpowered its politics. What Nixon did was suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold, the foundation of the Bretton Woods Promise. For decades, every foreign central bank had believed that the paper they held could be redeemed for gold at $35 an ounce. Now that contract was dead. The world's reserve currency had just defaulted, politely, with a smile, on primetime television. Why? Because the numbers no longer fit inside reality. By 1971, U.S. gold reserves stood around 260 million ounces, roughly $10 billion at the official price. But foreign holders of dollars had over $50 billion in claims, 5 times more promises than metal. De Gaulle's gold request in the 1960s had only been the beginning. By 1971, Britain and Switzerland joined the queue. The arithmetic was simple. If everyone asked for their gold, Fort Knox would be empty in months. So the government did what every empire eventually does when the math turns against it. It changed the rules. The dollar was no longer as good as gold. It was gold by decree. Nixon's team called it a temporary suspension. History calls it the birth of pure fiat currency. At that moment, the debt law became absolute. There was no longer any external limit to how much the United States could borrow or issue. Money became entirely political, and yet more addictive than ever. The consequences were immediate. Freed from gold's anchor, the dollar began to float. Inflation surged, and the price of gold exploded from $35 to over $800 by 1980. The 1970s became a decade of confession. America could print promises faster than the world could produce goods, and those promises were the new weapon of empire. Oil, the lifeblood of modern civilization, became the next collateral. In 1974, after the OPEC crisis, Washington struck a quiet deal with Saudi Arabia. Price oil exclusively in dollars, and the U.S. would guarantee military protection. The Petrodollar was born, a new gold standard, not in metal, but in energy. Every country that needed oil now needed dollars, and to get dollars, they bought U.S. debt. The pyramid was rebuilt, taller than ever. But the cost of this new architecture was invisible: inflation, inequality, and dependence. When money is created by borrowing, prices rise faster than wages, and wealth flows to those closest to the source: the banks, the asset owners, the government contractors. The middle class pays for expansion with time, their lifetime. By the 1980s, debt no longer sounded dangerous. It was patriotic again. Politicians could fund tax cuts, wars, and welfare all at once. Wall Street learned that leverage was not a risk, but a career. The Federal Reserve learned that every crisis could be solved by creating more credit. Each rescue, from the 1987 crash to the 2008 meltdown, was built on the same mechanism Nixon unlocked that night: infinite liquidity, backed by infinite belief. Yet the underlying truth never changed. The arithmetic always wins. Because when debt compounds faster than income, one of two things must eventually happen. Either the debt is erased, or the currency that measures it is devalued. That's not ideology. That's math. Nixon didn't end Bretton Woods. He revealed it. The illusion of stability, the faith in sound money, the idea that debt could expand forever, all exposed by a simple ratio. Too many promises, not enough gold. So when he told the nation their dollar would still be worth the same tomorrow, he was speaking to faith, not numbers. And the numbers, quietly, relentlessly, were already rewriting history. If you've ever wondered why every financial crisis since 1971 feels like déjà vu, it's because the system never reset. It only learned to float on deeper water. If this made the Nixon Shock suddenly make sense, tell me in the comments what year your country went off gold. If you're hearing this in 2025, know this: you're living inside the longest credit cycle in human history. Every dollar, every mortgage, every safe asset, all of it traces back to that August night in 1971, when money became pure promise. The debt law didn't end, it globalized. After Nixon, the United States discovered that debt wasn't a burden, it was leverage over the world. The new imperial export wasn't oil, cars, or wheat, it was Treasury bonds. The IOUs of a government became the foundation of global reserves, bank portfolios, and pension funds. Everyone, from Beijing to Berlin to Buenos Aires, began to save in American debt. That's the irony of the modern age. The biggest debtor in history is also the most trusted. And the reason is structural. Every dollar that leaves the U.S. must return eventually as someone's investment in American assets. The trade deficit isn't a flaw, it's a pipeline. Goods flow out of Asia, dollars flow back into U.S. bonds. The world produces, America consumes, and debt glues it all together. In 1945, the national debt was $260 billion. By 1980, $900 billion. By 2008, $10 trillion. Today, it's over $34 trillion and rising by about $1 trillion every 100 days. But nobody panics because the rules have changed. As long as the U.S. can issue new bonds and the Federal Reserve can buy them, the game continues. This is the perpetual motion machine of modern finance. When the Treasury borrows, it issues bonds. Banks buy those bonds with money created by the Fed. The bonds become collateral for even more loans, more derivatives, more layers of synthetic wealth. From hedge funds to pension systems, everyone's balance sheet depends on that same chain. The entire planet has become a mirror reflecting American debt back at itself. And yet, this machine isn't capitalism in the classical sense. It's a hybrid, part market, part state, part illusion. Central banks are no longer neutral referees, they're players. Every crisis becomes an excuse for expansion. In 2008, when the mortgage bubble burst, the Fed created trillions to buy bad assets. In 2020, during the pandemic, it printed even more, not just to rescue banks, but to directly fund government spending. The line between fiscal and monetary policy disappeared. Here's the quiet truth no one likes to say. The United States doesn't tax its empire, it inflates it. When new dollars are issued, they ripple through the world economy, devaluing older ones. The cost of that inflation is paid by everyone who holds dollars, foreigners, savers, and the working class. It's a hidden tax that sustains the illusion of wealth without ever asking for consent. Meanwhile, other nations learned the same trick. Japan built its prosperity on endless government debt. Europe institutionalized it through the European Central Bank. China built cities and industries on borrowed dollars, then lent those dollars back to Washington. The cycle became planetary, a synchronized addiction to leverage. But beneath the digital screens, the same old logic hums. Growth built on borrowing, stability purchased with inflation, progress paid for by tomorrow. The numbers have outgrown the politics again. In 2023, the interest payments on U.S. debt exceeded $1 trillion, more than the defense budget. The empire now pays interest to sustain belief in its own credit. It's a system that can't stop expanding because contraction means collapse. So every new crisis, banking panic, pandemic, trade war, becomes fuel for the next round of borrowing. The economy no longer heals, it reinflates. And the longer it continues, the more the world's wealth concentrates in the hands of those closest to the money printer, the first receivers of new credit. This is how the debt law survived a century. It no longer hides behind gold or Bretton Woods. It hides in plain sight, in your mortgage rate, your grocery bill, your national budget. Every inflation, every bailout, every stimulus is another verse in the same long story that began with one question. What if debt could be money? Now we know the answer. It can, but only as long as everyone believes it will be repaid someday. If you're watching this and starting to see that we're living not in a free market, but in a debt-driven empire, drop a comment with one word: belief, because that's the only thing holding it all together. Every empire writes its laws in stone until the numbers erase them. Rome had its legions. Britain had its ships. And America, it has its balance sheet. That's what the debt law really is, a silent constitution of the modern world, written not in words, but in compounding interest. We live in an age where promises have replaced production. You don't need to mine gold or build factories, you just need to issue debt. And the miracle, or the tragedy, is that it works, until it doesn't. Because arithmetic doesn't negotiate, it doesn't vote, it doesn't care about politics. When debt grows faster than income, the end is predetermined. Not sudden, but inevitable. Like gravity. We've been trained to see borrowing as progress. Governments borrow for growth, households borrow for opportunity, corporations borrow for innovation. But underneath those euphemisms lies the same mechanism: time theft. We pull prosperity forward from tomorrow to spend it today, hoping tomorrow will somehow repay the loan. When an individual does that, it's called addiction. When a nation does it, it's called fiscal policy. History doesn't repeat, it recalculates. France did this with Assignan in 1790. They printed promises on confiscated church land, believing the paper would hold its value. It didn't. The currency collapsed, prices exploded, and faith, that most fragile form of capital, vanished overnight. The same arithmetic we turned in Weimar Germany, in Argentina, in Zimbabwe, and now it's embedded in the global financial code, invisible, digital, universal. The United States still stands not because it's immune, but because its debt is everyone's asset. The world can't afford its collapse, yet. But look closely and you'll see the cracks. Trillion-dollar deficits, debt ceiling theatrics, inflation rebranded as growth. These are not policy debates. They're symptoms of a system nearing the edge of its mathematical lifespan. There's a moral beneath all this, and it's older than economics. Systems don't collapse because of bad intentions. They collapse when numbers outgrow trust. When promises multiply faster than faith, faith becomes the currency, and it always devalues first. So if you take one thing from this story, let it be this: money is not wealth. Credit is not creation. And no empire, however mighty, can borrow forever from its own future. Arithmetic always collects.